everyone. So the name of my paper is The Psychohistorical Impacts of D.W. Winnicott's Mother, but we're also going to get into the contrast of Klein's mother and how it affects their theories, as in the Klein-Winnicott dialectic. This is a poem that Winnicott wrote in 1963 called The Tree. Mother below is weeping, weeping, weeping. Thus I knew her, once stretched out on her lap and now on a dead tree. As now on a dead tree, I learned to make her smile, to stem her tears, to undo her guilt, to cure her inward death. To enliven her was my living. Now mother is weeping, she must weep. The sins of the whole world weigh less than this woman's heaviness. Oh, Glastonbury, must I bring even these thorns to flower, even this dead tree to leaf? How in agony, held by dead wood that has no need of me, by the cruelty of the nail's hatred of gravity's inexorable and heartless pull, I thirst. It is I who die, I who die, I die, I. D.W. Winnicott's Mother. This poignant poem by Winnicott testifies to Winnicott's helpless and despairing experience in the face of a dead mother, or in the face of what can be seen to be a mother who is encased and engulfed in a schizoid depression. A schizoid depression is that of an undeveloped infant self that has died in its isolation within the internal world. As the child who is compelled to enliven the dead mother, Winnicott had no choice but to mother his mother, until his own emotionally starving infant self wanted to give up and die. However, in the process of being compelled to nurture his own undeveloped mother, Winnicott learned firsthand to play out the role of the false caretaking mother, false caretaking self, which he spoke about in his theorizing on the false self-character disorder personality. Through his mother, Winnicott also learned how to genuinely reach out and empathize with a dependent other, and it is easy to conjecture that this is the source of Winnicott's professional motivation to become a pediatrician who liked to teach mothers how to mother. This, in turn, led to his form of psychotherapy when he studied to be a psychoanalyst at the British Psychoanalytic Society Institute, and then rejected the totally intrapsychic focus in order to look at the early real environment of the infant, toddler, and child. D.W. Winnicott could then look at trauma and could then have a vision of all the false self-operations that constructed the arrested psyche of many individuals. D.W. was looking at the trauma of those who, in his words, did not have a good enough mother. Melanie Klein's mother. In contrast to the experience of Winnicott with his mother stands that of Melanie Klein and her mother. Klein's mother was not dead and schizoid. She was full of manic aggressive energy, and her false self was that of a narcissistic, grandiose self, not of a caretaker false self, more of a helpless, dependent child self. As delineated in Phyllis Groskart's 1986 biography of Melanie Klein, and in my 2014 book, Carnac book, The Klein-Winnicott Dialectic, Transformative New Metapsychology and Clinical Theory, Klein's mother was overtly manipulative, guilt-tripping, and micromanaging. She demonstrated a manic and omnipotent control and a profound narcissistic sense of entitlement. She even demanded that her daughter Melanie have her come along on her honeymoon with Arthur Klein. She also took over her daughter's family once Melanie had children, sending her daughter off to health spas on Arthur's dime while she hosted Arthur's business dinners. She was always inventing excuses to keep Melanie away, and she and her husband apart. Libusa, Melanie Klein's mother, was certainly no shrinking schizoid violet. Klein's theory would reflect the different form of mother she had from the mother of Winnicott. Further, I have theorized that Melanie Klein's metapsychology of the death instinct would reflect her denied and dissociated internal bad object mother, her demon lover mother, one who was projected out and or covered over with a false idealization that reflected a grandiose attitude. Such an attitude often got Klein in trouble but she often presumed that anyone who disagreed with her was expressing their instinctual envy. Contrasting mothers, contrasting theories. The mothers of the two theorists seem to form the background for the differing theories of Klein and Winnicott. Unlike Winnicott's attempt to repair himself through using his skills at mothering by caring for pediatric and psychotherapy patients, and unlike his interest in the traumatizing aspects of the real mother in the paternal environment, Melanie Klein launched her internal world focus. Klein attempted to repair herself by claiming that the outside mother was always a benign or positive influence, and all the trouble was inside the child and the adult, with the bad persecutory mother always being a fantasy mother inside each individual's internal world. Unfortunately, Klein herself didn't realize that she had a bad mother inside because she managed to dissociate and repress it, and to cover it over with an idealization. Consequently, for Klein, all the bad stuff is within, as opposed to Fairbairn's radical theory of primal trauma, and as opposed to Winnicott's view of environmentally induced trauma. By maintaining the belief that her bad mother was inside of her as an instinctual dynamic that was evidence of unconscious fantasy without real-world parental and maternal impact, Melanie Klein could defensively protect the image of her mother. In fact, she defensively protected the image from the impact of her whole life experience of her mother. This seems to have been a perpetual implication of primal guilt in the child, even before the child reached an age where authentic existential guilt for hurting the one you love becomes possible. Klein envisions guilt even before the depressive physician experience of regret, but she sees potential guilt as aggression projected out and then feared as a persecutory assault, when the mind is first born into the paranoid schizoid position and when it returns to that position to defend against both guilt and loss. Winnicott appeased his internal mother by projecting her onto parents who he cared for in a holding environment manner, trying to avoid interpretation. Klein, on the other hand, appeased her internal mother by making all children and adults solely responsible for the childhood aspects of the persecutory mother within. The sociological and historical divide. In 1955, when Klein first read her Envy and Gratitude paper, which was published in 1957, Winnicott sat in the audience and his head in his hand saying, she can't do this, she can't do this, and then walked out of the meeting, and he was saying this to Claire, his second wife. Then he walked out of the meeting, and as anecdotal biographical reports have it, declared, I am no longer a Kleinian. Winnicott was outraged by Melanie Klein's mode of interpretations to her patients in this paper. Klein was telling her patients about all the unconscious hostile attacks they were making on the analyst, which she cited from dream material in particular, along with behavior in the sessions, as well as unconscious fantasies and associations. In the paper, Klein also creates a theory in which it extends the idea of an innate death instinct in the form of innate hostile aggression, which implies intention, quite apart from Freud's death instinct theory of entropy or nirvana. In Envy and Gratitude, Klein extends her metapsychological theory of the death instinct from that of generalized hostile aggression to the more relational concept of unconscious envy being acted out against the other, often against the one on which one is dependent, as in the transferential mother in the analytic situation. When envy has its most vicious potency, it is either repressed or split off. Thus, Klein goes beyond the idea of an abstract death instinct metapsychology and brings the specifics of an assumed death instinct into the clinical session. She interprets the patient's unwitting attacks on her as a powerful transferential mother, and she does so as much as possible without taking any of it personally. She sees the patient's subtle hostility, which she reports in symbolic form through dreams, as the envy towards the powerful psychoanalyst, who is fancied to be omnipotent. Klein may have viewed her own mother as Klein interprets her patients to be viewing her, because her mother was so controlling that she assumed an omnipotent attitude. All Klein's interpretations in this paper focus on the unconscious transferential hostility of the patient, who she theorizes to be expressing their innate instinctual aggression in the form of the interpersonal feeling of envy. For Winnicott, this was a travesty because he had just spent the last years when training to be a psychoanalyst trying to convince his Kleinian analyst, Joan Revere, as well as others in the British Society and Institute, that it was not enough to interpret the patient's internal symbolic world. He spoke about the importance of the environment, meaning the whole experience of that which took place outside the psyche and the family and the outside mother and father and siblings in the house and social groups, all of which impacts took place on what he was to later call transitional space. Winnicott was speaking about good impacts and bad, but in the case of the bad, he was talking about real traumatizing agents in the child's first relationships, particularly going back to the mother, not only to Klein's internal world mother, but to the outside mother, who could be good or bad or terribly destructive and was certainly not always seen as benign, as in Klein's theory, the external mother. Ronald Fairbairn had gone all the way in that direction with his collected papers, which spoke in 1952, always of the traumatic impact to the real mother and subsequently of the real family and father and family. So Winnicott left his Kleinian analyst in the Kleinian group. His rage of the Kleinians had been building up before, when all that he wrote from his perspective was rejected by their publications, as well as when they had a special anniversary volume with Kleinian contributions that he was excluded from. After walking out of the conference where Klein was presenting envy and gratitude, Winnicott declared, "I'm no longer a Kleinian." So then Winnicott was on his own. With writings on good enough mothers, developmentally containing holding environments, and writings on clinical technique and eventually on transitional objects and transitional space, Winnicott began to draw followers. He was aided by the editing of Masood Khan to make his poetic, quixotic, and paradoxical work comprehensible. What is known as the independent group began to form. And before he knew it, Winnicott was banging out tunes on a piano in his home while aspiring psychotherapists gathered there in his living room. These were the heretics, ones frowned on by the British Psychoanalytic Society, who did not see psychotherapists as qualifying in any degree as psychoanalysts. Kleinians looked down their manic defense noses at those who were pedestrian enough to focus on the external world of their patients. The British Psychoanalytic Group quite clearly stated to one another that Winnicott was a maverick who rejected the fundamentals of innate instinctual impulses that could become symbolized psychic fantasies. This was a cultural phenomenon indeed. In a world where splitting was a term for psychic dissociation, splitting was being played out in the Psychoanalytic Society. The British Society had at first been threatened by Anna Freud's Freudian group having different theories and beliefs from the Kleinians. That followed the great debates where the Kleinians and Freudians tried to Freudians tried to understand one another, mostly with the Kleinians having to explain their theoretical terms, especially in terms of psychic fantasy. The concept of psychic fantasy was well explicated by Susan Isaacs. Isaacs used anecdotal tales of her own daughter as a means for explaining the pre-verbal predisposition to what later would be symbolized and verbalized psychic fantasy. With the end of the great debates, the splitting British Society managed to salvage their whole entity by having two tracks for training, the Freudian and the Kleinian tracks. But what to do about this weird guy, D.W. Winnicott? He was outside the doors of the British Society, never having completed his Kleinian analysis. Nevertheless, it was outside the doors of the Great Society with the great debates that a lively group of mavericks began to form with their new propaganda of mutuality. They gathered in Winnicott's living room and sang together as Winnicott led the chorus, banging the keys of the piano and crying out, "Mi casa es su casa," my house is your house. Then they exploded onto the London stage when Winnicott began broadcasting his thinking in the form of talks to ordinary mothers on weekly radio broadcasts. The independent group had a guy with the capacity to play and the capacity for the creativity of everyday life. Winnicott was a mascot of spontaneity, the true self in action, even as he had his heart attacks, which had eventually freed him from bondage to his first wife, Alice, the invalid wife, who never allowed him to consummate his first marriage. Now there were 3 psychoanalytic cultures in Britain. 2 were in-house at the British Psychoanalytic, and 1 was outside, in Winnicott and Claire's living room. This divide, without an overt violent splitting, but with a lot of mutual rejection, became the 3 avenues of ascendance to a career as a mental health clinician in London and Britain. Those at Tavistock built on Winnicott's views of real-life trauma and the environmental influence, such as Michael Balin, who wrote Primary Love, 1953, and The Basic Fault in 1968. Some retained their Kleinian views, but expanded them out into thoughts about early pre-Oedipal trauma, from the time when the first core self is forming. Balin had inherited Sandor Ferenczi's practice and was trying to put some boundaries around the work with his primitive patients. He was also experimenting with therapeutic touch. The theoretical divide and the clinical integration. Although politics and history divided the Kleinian group from the Winnicottian independent group, as well as from the Freudians, the core truths within both the Kleinian and Winnicottian clinical theory, dogmatic metapsychology aside, can be integrated to make possible the most profound and effective clinical work. This integration allows psychoanalysis to be a spiritual practice of healing. This is the message of its therapeutic action, when core aspects of the theories of D.W. Winnicott and Melanie Klein are combined for clinical work. This is a combination of the heart as well as the theoretical integration of the head. When we combine Winnicott's theory of object survival from the use of the object and Klein's 1940 theory of mourning as a critical clinical and developmental process and expand its dimensions through my own theory of developmental mourning, we evolve an approach to integrating the split off and repressed areas of the unconscious psyche that is totally organic, like Argentine tango. Then we no longer have a need for mechanistic terms such as affect regulation or ego functioning. We transcend all this and join in an innate organic nature, while still practicing the complex art of transference and resistance work of traditional psychoanalysis. When we face our split-off parts and contain those of our own patients, we integrate the Jungian shadow parts of us and all the paranoid, schizoid, and manic aspects of our personalities. Then we are able to intuit the truth. We move forward into heartache from the dynamic dialect of our body-mind self. In my 2017 article in the Journal of International Forum of Psychoanalysis, I read at the beginning of Heartache, on the way to relatedness and intimacy through primal affects and symbolization. I speak of the movement to health through heartache. This article extends the clinical integration in many of my books and articles, but particularly from Mourning, Spirituality, and Psychic Change, a New Object Relations View of Psychoanalysis, and in 2003, Routledge, and the Anatomy of Regret, From Death Instinct to Reparation and Symbolization in Vivid Case Studies, 2013, Carnett. There are so many clinical aspects of Klein and Winnicott to combine. The combination of object survival, not abandoning or retaliating, with mourning is only one clinical variety. We also have a multitude of other combinations, including the mixture of transitional space and surrendering manic defenses against organic surrender. We also have the capacity for spontaneity and play combined with the reowning of split-off aggression and split-off eroticism. We also have the integration of Winnicott's capacity for concern with Klein's form of existential guilt in hurting the one you love. And then there is a combination of compassion and false self of Winnicott and the manic omnipotence of Klein, or the true self of Winnicott and the true versus manic form of reparation of Klein. And what of the parental capacity to receive reparation of Klein and the path to Ruth, following ruthlessness of Winnicott? Many other combinations of developmental and clinical truths can be seen when we digest the theories of Klein and Winnicott. Winnicott ran from the Kleinians and ran from writing about the internal world, but his transitional world and his growth towards concern and compassion are intricately woven from the cloth of Melanie Klein's depressive position tolerance for the combination of guilt and loss. This guilt is guilt in its heartfelt, organic, existential sense, not guilt as a defense of cognitive construction, such as Fairbairn's spurious guilt of the child in the moral defense. Along with the combination of explicit clinical tenets of Winnicott and Klein, it is helpful to facilitate this clinical combination by revising Klein's metapsychology. We can transform Klein's death instinct metapsychology into a metapsychology of symbolization, which has its roots back with the famous Kleinian Hannah Siegel in her paper on Notes on Symbol Formation, 1957. This brings Klein's clinical theory more into the developmental vantage point addressed by Winnicott. Further, such a transition and transformation in metapsychology allows some overlap with Fonagy's theory of mentalization, which brings the Anna Freud group into the clinical theory since Fonagy originated in the London Anna Freud group. This new psychoanalysis in the face of the superficial cognitive and behavioral approaches. In our current culture, where evidence-based superficiality, a phrase coined by the president of the Division of Psychoanalysis of APA, Marilyn Charles, in our current culture where evidence-based superficiality passes for psychotherapy, in-depth psychoanalytic object relations work is profoundly needed. In a time when cognitive work is functionally oriented and divorced from unconscious and dissociated parts of the self, we need a unique combination of theory for clinical practice that we can mine from the British and American object relations theorists, as I have done in my integrative theory of developmental mourning versus the demon-lover complex, which is pathological mourning. Integrating the theories of Klein and Winnicott is a major part of this work. The theories have been polarized as much due to politics as to any theoretical differences. With in-depth developmental understanding, these theories can continually be integrated for the most effective clinical work. With the integration of Klein and Winnicott, we have a theory that is set for a current scene and for the consulting room arena that psychoanalysts work in. I was gratified to see this recognized in a recent review of my book, The Klein-Winnicott Dialectic, New Transformative Metapsychology and Interactive Clinical Theory. The review by Dr. Neil Voris in the Journal of Psychoanalytic Psychology, the Journal of the Division of Psychoanalysis of APA, Division 39, speaks of how my integration of the two most influential theorists since Freud, with perhaps the exception of Wilfred Bion, allows for an immediate impact on our current therapeutic action. This reviewer, who is a distinguished teacher and scholar at IPA, acknowledges that the combination of these two brilliant theories of Klein and Winnicott, with the extension of their reach through my theory of developmental mourning versus the demon-lover complex, will have a direct impact on the clinical work of readers, as the book has its clinical influence on the reviewer's own work. I didn't know this man before he wrote the review, but I was very gratified by it. To have an integrated clinical theory is so very much needed in this day and age of multiple theoretical voices, and in this day of many therapies that address aspects of the whole psyche without addressing the gestalt of the brain and its unconscious, and without addressing the need for long-term clinical work for the healing of character disorders with developmental arrest, as well as for neurotics with repression and psychic conflict. The insurance industry has opposed the clinical work needed by its destruction of out-of-network mental health coverage. We are just discovering some long-term studies that support psychoanalytic work, since this kind of research is so difficult in terms of long-range longitudinal studies. These studies are supported by psychoanalysts with knowledge of neurology, such as doctors Alan Shore, Mark Soames, and Ina Rosenzweig, who you just heard. Okay. Now, I'm wondering if I skipped any pages because I was so worried about the time. Let me try to do it. I don't think so. Okay. No, I can get through it all. Okay. All right. Thank you.